Good morning. Welcome back to our conversation about finding God in the midst of where we are with COVID-19 and how we can respond in youth formation. Before we begin this morning, let me first of all mention last night with a word of gratitude for all of you who made time to be with us, whether you watched us live in a church and whether you were participating with other brothers and sisters across our diocese, or whether you were able to watch one of those talks online and just share your time with us in that way. I just want to, first of all, just say thank you, because your investment in being with us at this year's summit is an investment not only in the lives of our teens and our younger students, but it's also an investment in what God is trying to do in a very particular season in our life. We mentioned to you last night that this year's Youth Summit was going to focus on us as ministers, knowing that if we're going to do whatever He tells us to do, as we are going to let Him lead us at this very particular season in our history, it's important that we put ourselves in a position to be found. As we were praying as a team about how to serve you best this year, we were led to this conversation that you and I are about to have, and we really felt that it was an invitation for us just to do spiritual direction. And so what is spiritual direction? Spiritual direction is simply a conversation that you have with a spiritual director to help you in the more important conversation, which is the conversation with God. So you might say a good spiritual director just helps us find God in the midst of where we are in life. And that's my hope in our conversation this morning, that we can find God in the midst of where we are. So let's start with where we are, right? I remember being at the funeral of my grandfather when I was a young boy, and my grandmother said something to the effect of the only place to start is to be where you are. And I would give us that wisdom today. The only place for us to start our conversation today is for us to be where we are. So where are we? Or perhaps more importantly, where have we been? I want to first start with what COVID felt like. COVID didn't ask our permission. COVID came and it disrupted our life, and it altered every one of our lives. It has affected every one of us. But it didn't ask our permission, and that elicits lots of emotions. And we all had our emotions toward COVID, and I do want to take you back to take a look at those emotions, because I think it's really important that we're honest with what's happening inside our hearts. I often tell spiritual directors, as I'm training them, that usually what comes out of our mouth usually started in our heart. And as we find ourselves working with young people, helping them find God in the midst of their lives, what's going to come out of your mouth is probably going to first start in your heart. So it's important for us to be honest with our emotions about what was happening with COVID in March and April and May and June and July. I think a lot of us, whether we had the language for it or not, were afraid that you might get COVID-19, right? There was all this information on the news, and there was all of this perhaps even misinformation on the news, and there was this blanket of fear, at least in my own family, about am I going to get COVID? Are my mom and dad going to get COVID? You know, my dad is 82, mom is 76, and they're in that window where they were very susceptible and vulnerable. I had a lot of fear about whether my own mom and dad are going to get COVID. As we moved into April and May, on one hand, I carried this awkward fear that they might get sick, but I didn't know anybody who was diagnosed with it. And then in June, a dear friend of mine who's in perfect health got diagnosed with COVID and really struggled with it for 2 weeks. And it became very personal and very serious. And I continued to carry a fear of what might happen if mom and dad get it, or if I get it. I became overly kind of paranoid about going to the grocery store and washing my hands and sanitizing once I got back in the car and all kinds of things like that. But isn't it interesting the way that COVID has just kind of affected our emotions, right? There's also a fear that maybe the people, for those of you who are parents or married, that the people inside your home might get it. And if they get sick, then are you going to get sick? And it's not just what's going to happen out there, but like the people that we love real close to us are going to get it. And everybody handles it in their own very particular way, right? So We have our emotions and people have their emotions. And I don't know if you noticed this at all, but it was really kind of odd in, let's call it April and May, where I found like there was just a little extra noise in some of my conversations with my family members or people that I love dearly. And I think it was just all the extra stress in life with, are they social distancing? Am I social distancing? Are we going to wear masks? What's everybody's opinion about masks? All that kind of stuff. Like, it just affected relationships. And as we are relational people, especially in South Louisiana, right, that has its own effect on us. Maybe not now, but do you remember how much people were worried about their finances? I mean, if you go back to March, where it started into April, maybe you were actually affected with finances. Maybe you or someone you know lost their job, or maybe you or someone you know was affected with your investments because of the stock market and things like that. Whether it's the small stuff like, just not spending money because we're afraid, or actually losing money because of different things. Like, there was a lot of anxiety in the air because of COVID with our finances. And there was also just the fear of the unknown. Like, we've never been here before with this thing, and what's it look like, and what's it do to the body, and who's going to get it, and how do you get it, and how do you get rid of it, and how long is it going to be here? And I think just the unknown brought a lot of fear, but I also think it eventually brought some frustration. And so when I think about where I have been and where I think a lot of us have been, there's this roller coaster of starting out with the unknown and doing whatever we can, right, to be in compliance. And then I think a lot of us went through this experience of just feeling trapped by COVID because it's affecting my life, and trapped by COVID because we had to stay at home, and then trapped by COVID because we couldn't do the things that we used to do or interact with people the way we interacted. And then I think a lot of people went through this whole season of being tired and fatigued by it, and I think a lot of people just want their life back. And so here we are in August, and we're about to go back to school, and it seems like the numbers are the same in August as they were in April. And we're close to being in the same situation at schools as we were when we shut them down with numbers and things like that. Now, the good news is that, of course, we know a lot more and we are equipped to respond, but I just want us to feel like there have been a lot of emotions in our heart. And what happens is when we simply deny those emotions, it will come out in two ways if we're not careful. And that's what I want to draw your attention to. If we're not in touch with our emotions, it'll come out in almost a complaining or an irritation that things have changed. I'm going to come back to that in a couple seconds. But as you know, for those of you who are in youth formation, complaining that parents drop off their kids and they don't do anything with those kids, it doesn't make an impact in the young person's life. And it's not an effective strategy for actually changing that trend, right? So complaining about the situation not only does not make an impact for change, but it actually, I think, changes the atmosphere that we live in and makes us less likely to be creative enough to change. So if we're not in touch with our emotions, then what will happen is we'll get caught up into complaining about this with COVID or complaining about that in COVID. The second danger that I want to draw our attention to is if we're not in touch with our emotions, is we are going to revert back to where we're comfortable so that we don't have to feel those emotions. It could be wanting to go back to the comfortable of the way that CCD used to be, where we just had to cover the material. It could be a temptation to go back to where things are comfortable, where we didn't have to dive into the messiness of wearing masks and the possibility of doing stuff online, and it'll just affect us in that way, right? We'll go back to what's comfortable. I want to be real clear with you, as a spiritual director, as a priest with you, both of those are temptations. Those are not invitations, nor are they from the voice of God. We have to be in touch with what's going on inside of us if we are going to be able to effectively work with our teenagers and our younger students and help them get in touch with where is God in their life, which requires that they get in touch with how they're doing, right? And so I think one of the things that COVID did is it exposed a lot of things. That's what crisis tends to do. Crisis tends to expose. I think the COVID, it exposed a hunger in people to live again. How many people, as soon as COVID hit, said, hey, we're going to have family dinner again. We're going to have game night again. We're going to have conversations at the table where we're not going to have our devices. I think it exposed that people have a lot of hunger in their heart to just rediscover how to live. But I think it also exposed that those conversations at the dinner table got tough with young people. Living life in a new rhythm once all the projects at the house were over and we couldn't go to Home Depot one more time, right? I think it exposed that sometimes we don't know how to live in this art of living. I think a lot of us, as we just watched COVID, it exposed just how influential technology is in our life. I think it exposed how addicted we have become to our phones. I think it's exposed how addicted we have become to the latest notification or the latest thing that's out there. It's also influenced the way that we interact with each other as a family. I mean, imagine what was it like to be able to have real conversation with people and then to have people go back to their old ways. So I think what COVID exposed was the influence of technology just on people in general. But COVID also exposed collectively as a Catholic Church, and I say this with great kindness, please, so hear it, just how far behind we are when it comes to the use of technology, right? So we are, in the Catholic Church, we are, our evangelization platform, you might say, for the last 2,000 years has been sacramental in nature. And when the inability to share those sacraments was removed, collectively as a whole, and I say this with great love, we didn't know how to respond. And now some of our priests did a heroic job rolling up their sleeves and figuring out how to live stream Mass. But when we look at a digital presence, a way to effectively communicate on an ongoing basis, I think COVID exposed, just where we are as a church when it comes to technology. And why is that important, and how is it connected to emotions? Stay with me here. Those young people that we are ministering to are not ill-equipped in their ability to deal with technology. They use it all the time. They use it effectively. They use it almost inhumanly, right? They are not inept when it comes to the use of technology. And so what it exposed was there was just a gap of we were, as a church, collectively, as a Roman Catholic Church across the world, unable to respond as fast as our young people were using technology. For many of us who are attentive to our hearts, that may have elicited a grief of things are changing. We're not teaching out of a book anymore with COVID, right? We can't even be in the same room with people anymore. And all of a sudden, people are watching this online and watching that online. And I don't know, did your parish start doing stuff online? Did your youth formation team just start jumping online and doing stuff, right? There can be a grief that pops up in our heart. Now, that grief is influential. It comes in the form of frustration. I can't believe this is happening. Or we can get mad at COVID. Or we can begin to blame teenagers because they act like this, and this. And look, here's the thing. All of those emotions are coming from grief because it exposed, wow, things have changed. Now, I don't know how attentive you've been to what's been cooking in your heart, but if you want to find God right now in COVID as a youth formator, you're going to find God right there inside the grief. And you're going to find a God who's ready to teach us how to minister, but we're going to find him right there. I think one of the things that COVID exposed is that our young people are struggling. I think a lot of our young people are just done with COVID, and like they couldn't go to the gym, they couldn't go hang out with their friends, they couldn't do this, and even though they have an online world, right? Even that online world, right, isn't going to satisfy them with all the other restrictions that they had. So on one hand, I think COVID exposed that our youth are struggling, but again, I think COVID also exposed that as a church collectively, maybe we didn't have the kind of relationships with our youth that we thought we did. Right? So how easy was it for us to stay in touch with our young people? How easy was it for us to kind of walk with them through the trenches that were there, right? For a lot of us, that was either difficult or impossible. For a lot of us, that didn't happen. And what COVID exposed is you take away a classroom from our structure, and it's difficult for us to have any relationships with our young people. And if we didn't have them going into COVID, then we certainly either struggled in nurturing them or maintaining them once COVID started. What did COVID expose? I think COVID exposed that our adults in the pew are struggling. How many people are drifting in the faith? I look at some of my own family members who are struggling right now. Hey, I'm a priest, and I see the numbers just like many of you do. And I know people who were at a certain spiritual openness right before COVID started. Remember, COVID started in the second week of Lent. Lent's a time where people come back to church, their hearts are open. And I got to be honest with you, I was a little angry that Lent happened the way this year, because I knew so many adults who were like, okay, I need a really good Lent. And even before Easter hit, they were already kind of fading away. A lot of our adults are struggling, right? Either they're struggling because they're super faithful and they're committed and they just want to get back to Mass and they can't get back to Mass, or a lot of them are struggling because they just found new routines on Sunday. And that's just where they are. And we're going to have to reach out to them and give them a reason to come back, right? But not only are adults struggling, but COVID exposed that some of the people that may be watching this video right now are struggling. You know, there's adults that are struggling. They're just invisible people. Some of them were teaching second grade CCD last year, and some of them were working with our confirmation students in March, right? Some of the people on your youth formation team may be struggling. Right? So it's important for us to acknowledge that the game changed, and it didn't ask our permission. Now look, the game changed a long time ago, but it certainly changed in March of 2020. Mass changed, right? We weren't able to celebrate Mass. We had to live stream Mass. Priests had to say Mass in front of cameras rather than people for Easter and the Triduum, right? It feels different going back to Mass right now, right? With masks and social distancing and pews with tape on them and things like that. Like, doesn't Mass feel different? Like, the game has changed, right? The number of people at Mass is also very different, right? And that affects Catholics in a lot of different ways. When you walk into Mass and you're used to seeing this many people, and now you walk into Mass and you see this many people, it feels real weird. And I think there are a lot of people who are struggling just with the fact that it just seems like things have changed and we don't know when it's going to get back to better, right? Then of course there's masks and we have to social distance with anything on campus. Can we do anything in person on campus, right? Right. So why would I say all that? It's important for us to acknowledge where we are rather than where we want to be, or rather than where we wish we were. Because every one of those young people who we're going to be ministering to this year went through everything that I just said. And unless we make the gospel relevant to them in that situation, then I think we may be tempted to revert back to a disconnect after we've worked so hard to connect. If we're going to serve our youth this semester, all that stuff we're teaching, it's got to connect to where they are. And a lot of them are right there in their emotions. So here's the thing. It didn't ask our permission, but we are where we are. Now, with everything that has changed, a lot of things haven't changed, right? People's lives are still at stake. And you and I have an opportunity right now, and that's what this weekend's all about, to make a decision as to whether or not we are going to choose to minister to young people in the circumstances of 2020 with COVID, rather than wishing that this would all be over, or can we just get back to the way that we used to do things? If we could do that, like I would give that gift to you, but we can't. But we have to make a decision now as to whether or not we're going to choose to be in the circumstances that we're in, and if we're going to choose to be with the people that are in those circumstances. When I was in the seminary, I first heard God's call when I was in high school, and I heard God's call a lot when I was in college, and then, of course, after college is when I made my decision. But, I've heard God's voice often in my life calling me to the priesthood. When I was a year out from ordination to being a deacon, I was in third theology, and I was really struggling, am I supposed to do this? And a little crisis in faith, and struggles in celibacy, and I was like, man, I'm a year away from ordination. And I was really, really struggling. And my spiritual director looked at me one day and he said, Mark, God is never surprised. It's not like God called me when I was in high school and in college and after college, and all of a sudden I got to third year theology and I'm struggling, and God's up there in heaven going, man, I never saw that coming. Right? God's not surprised. When God called me when I was younger, he knew then that I would eventually struggle when I was in my third year of theology. Right? God's not surprised, but he's still called. Y'all, God's not surprised with COVID. He didn't make COVID, but he's not surprised. And when he called you to serve real people in youth formation, he knew COVID was going to be here, and he still called you. And when he called you, he didn't call you so that when we got to the fall of 2020, we would complain, or we would wish, or we would kind of punt. No, he knew exactly when he called you how we were together going to make it through this time. So if God's not surprised, and if God is ready to move forward, then here's my encouragement to you. Don't be surprised either. And if we're going to let God lead us in the fall of 2020, we have to be honest with where we've been prior to the fall of 2020, so that none of that stuff gets in the way of us hearing God's voice. Let me give you a practical example. Let's say that me and a really good friend of mine are in relationship, and we're best friends. We do everything together, and we've had a relationship for years. And let's pretend that in March of 2020, something happened in our relationship that went unspoken. Maybe they did something to me, or I did something to them, or something just happened, and we never talked about it. And let's say that it really hurt me. Now it's August of 2020, and let's just say I'm back with my buddy, right? I'm back with my friend. And they make a comment that reminds me of what happened in March of 2020. And all those emotions get stirred up. And they keep talking. Am I listening to them? Or am I listening to them through the filter of all that was in my heart because of what was unresolved with March of 2020? Now, those of you who are married, you probably know well what this feels like if you've ever had an argument with your spouse. And any of us who've been in a relationship where two ordinary people get in messy lives hurt each other, you know what this is like. The same is true in our relationship with God. God is trying to speak to us right now about, hey, this is what I want you to do in youth formation. Just do this. And are we going to hear that? Well, that depends on whether or not our ears don't have the filter don't have the noise of everything that happened since the middle of March all the way through where we find ourselves as you're watching right now. So I want to bring us right back to where you were last night as we were praying together. As God finds you, where are you? How you doing? And are you ready to move forward? Now, the next time that we see each other, we're going to talk about that. How do we move forward? How do we proactively and creatively engage with our young people? But I wanted to start this morning by us just being honest with where we are and do we see God with us in our life right now? Have you been white knuckling it? Have you just been trying to do it on your own? Have you been listening to God? Or do you have any sense that God's with you? Like, how you doing with God? And how you doing with God in the circumstances of your life? How have you dealt with COVID? The next time that we get together, we're going to actually allow the Lord to reveal how he's going to ask us and lead us to be creative. But right now, what I want to do is I want to ask us to pray about where we are and what's really going on in our hearts. I'm reminded of the beauty of Psalm 139. And I want to draw your attention to Psalm 139, verses 1 to 16. That's going to be the next step for us. And you'll get some instruction about where we're going to go next. But what we want to do right now is just give you a chance to pray. And I want to encourage you to pray with Psalm 139, verses 1 to 16. And as you pray with that, I'm going to ask that you read that psalm 3 times. You're going to read it the first time and just get familiar with the text. The second time you read it, I just want you to slow down a little bit and pick a word or phrase that kind of like jumps on your heart, right? Then read it a third time even slower and see if that same word or phrase or maybe a different one kind of gets your attention. And then just talk to God about that, right? And then let him speak back to you. But Psalm 139 verses 1 to 16 is where we are. Where is God in your life right now with COVID? Looking forward to being with you again this afternoon as we talk about going forward. But until we see you, God bless you.